Is tanking hard? I feel like some people get a warped sense of what a tank actually does and make it more complicated than it really is. At its bare bones, a tank's main purpose is to gain aggro on something and make sure that it's hitting them and not anyone else. That's really all that a tank's purpose is. But obviously, that's not where it stops. There's a lot more to it than just that, but I do think people tend to make it seem like it's this super hard thing that only the most hardcore of the hardcore should do. So I want to just talk about it a little bit, talk about it a little bit more detail. I'm not saying that tanking is just completely easy. I'm just also saying that it's not as hard as the perception of tanking actually is. So first off, let's talk about the tank classes themselves. Pretty much across the board, actually playing the class is relatively simple. One of the things that Blizzard has done in recent years to try to attract more people towards tanking is take a lot of the difficulty out of actually playing and managing the class from a rotational aspect. Regardless of what you do in single target or multi-target, you're basically going to be pressing the same buttons. They've really tried to make sure that every single tank has an AoE ability that you're going to use regardless of the situation. All of them have this, whether it's Blood Boil, or Avenger's Shield, or Thrash, or Thunderclap, or Immolation Aura, or Keg Toss. All of these abilities you're going to want to use in single target, but they're all AoE abilities. This makes it extremely easy to start picking up, especially in dungeons, where if you don't know what to press, you know you're at least supposed to press that. And if you do that, then you're going to be getting aggro on everything around you. So from the very base perspective right there, right at the beginning, we have aggro on everything, which is, like I said at the beginning, is the main point of a tank. So as long as you're just pressing this one button that's very integral to your spec, not only are you helping yourself out by pressing that button for the class and what you need to generate, whether that be resources or charges for your mitigation or whatnot, you're also going to be picking up aggro and doing a lot of damage as well. On top of that, once you've gained aggro on something, it's very difficult for a tank to then lose that aggro. Really, the only way that's going to happen is if a hunter's pet taunts off of you or another DPS uses their taunt ability on a mob. Those things pretty much shouldn't happen, but that's really the only way that you're going to be losing aggro, or unless you just decide to go AFK for like 3 minutes and eventually they'll pull it off of you. But as long as you're still behind your keyboard, you're going to be keeping aggro on it just by playing the class from there. On top of that, every tank has an ability that's considered active mitigation. This is a relatively short cooldown defensive ability that's meant to be used often, as well as it's used to negate very powerful abilities that bosses have in dungeons and raids. So the combination of this ability having a relatively short cooldown, and it's the ability you need to use for these really powerful abilities, really helps out, because even if you're using it maybe more than you should, you don't always have to worry about it, since it's going to be coming back off cooldown, or you'll be able to generate those resources or whatever you need in order to use that ability. You're going to be able to do so relatively quickly. None of the tanks have like a long gap between one application of your active mitigation and the next one. There's usually some way to get it back fairly quickly so you can use it again. This makes it kind of the easiest ability to use to help reduce your damage and help keep you alive without really having to try very hard. If you don't know what else to do, press your active mitigation. If you see a big, powerful ability that the boss is about to use, press your active mitigation. If you at least do that, and you're just ignoring all of those scary, 3 and 5 minute cooldowns, if you're at least pressing your active mitigation, you're going to be able to survive most mechanics. Now, obviously, there are things that are a lot harder hitting, and you'll have to use your bigger cooldowns, those 5 minute cooldowns, but from a base level, if you're at least using active mitigation and using it when you need to, like I said, like with those abilities on those bosses, you're going to be okay for the most part. So far I've talked about single target situations, multiple target situations, and using your active mitigation to reduce incoming damage. All three of those things are the core principles of tanking, is being able to do that. And all three of those things are pretty easy at a very baseline level. I mean, we're talking maybe 5 or 6 buttons at most to at least be able to do that. So everything that I've just talked about is like 90% of tanking. Or, maybe it's 80, but it's most of what tanking is about. The other bit, the whatever 10%, 20%, is probably 20%, but whatever, is learning how to use those bigger cooldowns, the things that actually do take some sort of time management behind them, like Icebound Fortitude or Vampiric Touch or Guarding the Ancient Kings, stuff like that. But overall, the basics of tanking are pretty simple. Now let's talk about the things that make tanking a bit more challenging. Now there are 2 major principles that I see a lot of newer tanks struggle with, and those are positioning and then just general knowledge of the encounter mechanics, whether that be raids or dungeons. So let's start off with positioning first. Positioning is kind of a all-encompassing word for how you are positioned in relationship to everything else, as well as how everything else is positioned to you. It's both ways. It's not just where you are, but it's where everything else is as well. I think everyone pretty much knows the concept of making sure that whatever you're fighting is facing away from the DPS, outside of very specific instances, like Guarm in the Trial of Valor. So I think that one's kind of a given. In general, you want to just automatically take whatever it is you're fighting and face it away from the rest of your group. But there's more to it than that. You also want to take into consideration where the boss or the mobs, whatever it is, and make sure that they are in the right place. Do you have a whole bunch of mobs? Maybe they're a bunch of caster mobs. You want to make sure that for the ease of your DPS, you want to cluster them together as much as you can. And there's multiple ways you can do that. You can do that with line of sight. You can do that with interrupts to try to bring them closer in. If you're Death Knight, you can use Gore Fiends or your grip ability. Use what you have at your disposal. Like, not everyone's a Death Knight, so you won't always have access to that, but you will definitely be able to have access to some sort of line of sight. Most dungeons have some sort of corners and stuff like that. And then there's also positioning in terms of like a boss like a Harboron in Maw of Souls, second boss there. Are you just tanking the boss in place pretty much and moving just when you need to? Or are you actually pulling the boss over to the servitors that have the interrupt that you have to deal with? And are you pulling them over to the fragments when those pull up, to just that way your DPS, your melee DPS especially, can just cleave off of the boss naturally and have those things get killed? Things like that are things you should also be thinking about. It's not just where the boss is, it's everything else around it and where it is in position or in relationship to everything else. Keeping with the example of Harboron, are you putting yourself in a corner and you're giving yourself almost no room to move with all those little splashes that comes out? Or are you looking for that next path to get to that next point where you need to be to get to that next servitor? You certainly don't want to have like servitors popping up in the middle of all that purple, so you're going to want to keep him moving to some degree, so that when he does pop up, that hopefully he won't be in the middle of it. So just things like that are things you should take into consideration when you're tanking. Along with everything we talked about, what I said makes tanking easy, things like this can be a little bit more subjective into how you want to handle it. And not everything has a 100% correct way to do it. There's a lot of style that you can put in on it yourself. And that to me makes it fun, but it also makes it a little bit more challenging when I say something like there's not a 100% set way to do it. And again, I like this example. It's really working out for me in terms of what I'm trying to explain. But keeping on that example again is, it's never going to be the exact same way, because where those puddles form is going to be different every time. So you've got to constantly be looking around the room and kind of being like, okay, this is there and this is there. So if I want to get from this side over to the next side, I've got to kind of make myself like a little path. And is it getting too crowded where I am right now with all these puddles? Do I need to pull them out? Where's the next servitor popping up? And things like that. So those are things you're going to want to keep in mind too. There's all the other bosses that do that. You can even take Helya, same dungeon, to keep on that train of thought. Where are the holes going to be formed in the boat? That's going to change the way that you're going to get from like one tentacle to the next one. Making sure that you're paying attention to when the big ones, I forgot what they're called. They're called Devastators, something like that. Destructors, yeah, that's what it's called. Destructor tentacles comes up. You want to make sure you're getting to them super quickly. So things like that, you're always going to have to be thinking about as well. So where are you? Where is everything else? How are you pulling mobs together in a multiple target situation, especially if you're dealing with a lot of casters? I made a paladin, so with paladins, they're kind of the kings of multiple interrupts, which makes it a lot easier for me. But if you're something like a druid, pulling around a corner, making sure that they're having to come around that corner and all stop right at you is a really great way to do that. So be thinking about things like that as well on top of the beginning things. And we'll move right into the next section of the things that make it harder, which is just general encounter knowledge. So what do I mean when I say general encounter knowledge? Well, it's just that. Making sure you know what you're doing in whatever dungeon or raid or whatever scenario, and making sure that you know the mechanics of those encounters that you're dealing with. It matters so much more for the tank than it does for any of the other roles, especially in high mythic plus keystones and, obviously higher tiers of rating. But even in LFR, if you go into the first wing of the newest raid, Antorus, the second boss with the dogs, if you don't know how to pull them apart, like if you didn't know that you were supposed to do that, I mean, you'll find out because people will be yelling at you in the chat. If you don't know that, then you're going to mess up and potentially just make that raid take forever. Like if you don't listen, or if you're not paying attention to what people are saying, and if you didn't know what they meant when they said pull them apart, that's going to be really detrimental to the raid. And the tank is one of the few classes, or the few roles, where if you wanted to, you can be the biggest troll in the world and literally keep progression from happening on whatever it is you're doing. So it does matter what you do as a tank. You can't go AFK like you can as a healer or DPS in LFR. You still have to do your role and pay attention to some aspect of it. You still have to do at least the bare bones minimum requirements. When you talk about dungeons, you absolutely need to know which abilities are like really important. For instance, Ilisana Ravencrest, I believe is her name. She has an ability called Vengeful Shear. If you don't actively mitigate that with whatever your active mitigation is, this hurts so much because it puts a debuff on you that increases her damage done to you by like 100% or something, and it stacks. So if you're missing this, and it can be easy to miss at times if she dashes away from you and you're something like a paladin that has to be in melee range to use your active mitigation, and active mitigation, and it has to be your active mitigation. So if you can't use anything else, otherwise you'll still get the debuff. So things like that, if you didn't know that was a thing, and you're doing something higher than like a +5, and you've got middling gear, like maybe like I don't even know what middling gear is considered anymore. Maybe like let's call it 915. So if you do that and you're doing like a +5 or a +6 and you get up to 2 stacks, you run a very high risk of dying. My paladin is 950-ish right now equipped, and if I do that on just like normal mythic, I'm sure that I would feel the difference between having no stacks and having even 1 stack. So very specific things like that you should know about beforehand, especially if you're not running with add-ons like Deadly Boss mods or Bigwigs or something like that, which I highly recommend, by the way, if you're not using them. But those are the kind of things that you need to know ahead of time. And I'm not saying that you have to spend like 30 minutes or 2 hours like just doing nothing but researching the different dungeons and their abilities, but you should know at the very least the ones that are noted with a skull in your dungeon journal. At the very least you should know those, or the ones that have the tank symbol next to them and stuff like that. There's just so many little small aspects in so many different dungeons that if you don't know what to do, you alone can mess up your group. And I think that aspect of not knowing what to do or messing up, you might know what you're doing, but if you mess up, that kind of leads us into the final point. So those were the 2 principles that I was talking about that I see a lot of tanks messing up on, is just not knowing what they're supposed to do. I was in a +13 the other day, I believe it was. It was like back in 7.2.5, and there was a warrior tank. We did the entire thing on +13. We got to the last boss, and he wasn't using shield block on the magma crash or whatever it's called. So things like that, you think that if you can make it through a +13, clearly you can finish the last boss, but for whatever reason he just wasn't using shield block. Sounds easy, right? But I mean, the previous bosses in that dungeon, you don't actually need to use your mitigation for anything other than Sunder on the second boss, but it doesn't do like a ridiculous amount of damage. And if you're using Ignore Pain, like he probably was, then the healer probably didn't even notice. So when you take things like that into consideration, he might just not have known that it had to be shield block. And it ended up, we wiped and we wiped and we wiped again. And I told him, hey, bro, you need to use shield block. And at that point, there were some other people in the group that started ragging on him, and the group disbanded. So again, leading into my next point, the final thing that can make tanking challenging is backlash and flaming. And that's like the stealth thing that makes tanking hard, is dealing with other people, dealing with the flaming and the toxicity of other people sometimes, and how you handle that, your mental fortitude when it comes to dealing with it. Can you just keep going and ignore it, or just say sorry and move on regardless of what they say? If you can't, and you just start letting this affect you and getting to you and wearing you down, you're going to find tanking unfun and just not want to do it. And it doesn't matter if you're just now learning. People who've been tanking forever still deal with this. It doesn't matter how good you are either. Eventually you're going to have a bad day and someone's going to let you know about it. So dealing with those situations, how you act in those situations is what's going to make tanking hard on a different level, on a mental level, on a social level. So if you can deal with this in a good way by either just saying sorry and forgetting about it, or just ignoring it and moving on and not letting it affect you, is another way that tanking can just be more difficult. So that's kind of my overarching view of all things tanking and how I feel about them. Yes, there's obviously some little things out there that you could sprinkle in as well, but those are the main things as I see it. Obviously, there's one last thing that I've omitted from talking about too much, which is just experience in general. The more experience you have, it will ultimately make everything easier. It's the same thing across any of the specs. So that's kind of why I left that out. But obviously, the more experience you have, the easier it's going to be. Practice, practice, practice. Put yourself in situations that you can learn from and go from there. But as far as, tanking in general, going back and kind of in summary now, is just like from a class perspective, from a spec perspective, playing a tank spec is pretty easy. I don't feel like there's a whole lot of challenge behind just pressing the buttons on the keyboard and getting a result. There's nothing terribly confusing about it across all of the tanks. The depth of the class comes from a lot of the positioning aspects of it, how you use your abilities, how you use your longer abilities, the things that are on longer cooldowns, by that I mean, and how you're managing your rotation from your defensive abilities. It's not about so much your offensive abilities. You're going to get aggro, you're going to do damage, but are you going to handle that damage in a good way? Is there a better way you can be doing that? How can you push yourself to do more and more challenging content? Things like that, how to position, how to learn from the fights, knowing the fights really well. Those are the things that make tanking a lot more challenging. It's not the class, it's everything else. It's the dungeons and the raids and such like that. So is tanking hard? I'll leave that up to you. But for me, it's a mix of both. It's, a little bit of the easy side with actually just playing the class, and it can be a little bit challenging with the encounters themselves, especially encounters that change each time you do them. So you let me know what you think. Is tanking hard? I'd love to hear what you think about it. Outside of that, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.